On today's episode of Political Business, the fallout from the budget 1 week on.
And a story in the FT about a possible Tory reform deal.
And finally, we're going to look at the third-party post-May landscape in London and beyond.
So let's kick off with the budget, Kevin. We've spoken quite a lot about this in recent episodes. Rachel Reeves delivered her budget last week. We gave some analysis quickly after. And I think what we said in that episode was largely a budget for Labour MPs, largely a budget to reassure the markets. And I think 1 week on, we can say that on both of those counts, mission accomplished. However, wider public and the polling that's come out since the budget is that, from opinion even, 48% of people think it's been a bad budget, only 15% think it's been a good budget. Over half of those polled said the autumn budget makes them more concerned about Britain's economy. So budget successful from a market and internal Labour political point of view, public not so much. How is this faring within the Labour Party?
Well, I think that analysis of gone down well with Labour MPs, gone down well with the markets, but not so well with the public. I think a centre-right government in the 80s would have been happy with that analysis. You're absolutely right. It's mission accomplished on its primary short-term objective, which is Operation Keep Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves in office. So the mood in the Parliamentary Labour Party is pretty buoyant in the short term. They got what they wanted on the two-child benefit cap being removed, which they were able to go back and hit the doors last weekend and had some good feedback from members of Parliament from across the country. Their local parties are feeling, better about Labour in government. But of course, those who think about the long term know that it's changed nothing when it comes to the next general election. When it comes to the public, when the facts change, the public will change their mind. I saw the same poll as you. I would observe, I'm not entirely sure what the average member of the public's frame of reference is to judge whether or not a budget is good for the macro economy or not. So that's probably just a reflection of the media coverage, in particular the media on the right. Fundamentally, however, and this is kind of my analysis and shared with some of my kind of parliamentary contacts and friends, admittedly on the right of the party, is there is absolutely no way the Labour Party is going to the next general election with, as this current budget sets out, a reduction in spending and an increase in taxation in that general election year. So basically what everyone's saying is the government's done the first part of the job, which is steady the ship, righted the wrong from last year's budget, built in the headroom. But actually, the only way there's a credible offer into the next general election, both on spending and on taxation, is, first of all, some movements on reducing spending. I think we're going to see some tough choices and, negotiations and battles with the Parliamentary Labour Party over the next 12 months. And secondly, growth. That wasn't, and I've had some arguments with friends about this, it wasn't a pro-growth budget. And that's supposed to be the primary mission of this government. They want to get back on to growth from Monday. And actually, I think basically the calculation is, in order to avoid this fiscal context set out in the budget, you'd need about 2% growth per annum, which is pretty toppy based on how the British economy has been performing in the last 10 years, but not out of this world towards the back end of the Parliament. So actually expect conversation to move back to growth measures. I think in the final analysis, and what we're talking about in terms of the budget this week is the OBR, the resignation of the chair over the leak. We're not really talking about, to any great extent, the detail of the budget. The budget's not unravelling. There was a bit of a panic over the weekend around business rates and some of the politics around that, and the high shoot in a very effective campaign started by UK Hospitality. But fundamentally, this isn't an omni-shambles budget, right? That was a big fear. And remember us saying that. This budget's not unravelling. It has its winners and it has its losers.
And presentationally, very difficult.
So it's kind of done it.
And chaotic, but as we've said,
done its job. Economically, it's done its job. And actually, the country goes into, economically, reasonably stable to the end of the year. All the talk about the markets would be frothy, or this ridiculous chat from Nigel Farage, the economically literate, about how we're going to be facing a sovereign debt crisis in Q1 and a general election next year, which is just ludicrous, isn't happening.
Let's see.
Well, it's just not. It's not true. The public is this government. Our economy is going to be facing the fastest fiscal contraction of any G7 country in the next 3 years.
Well, one of the things
we're not facing a sovereign debt crisis.
No, I think
the IMF is not coming to bail.
We all know why Nigel Farage is talking about that largely for political reasons. But what the OECD had said, for example, is that tax rises will act as a headwind to the British economy in the coming years. And I do think that when you combine that with some of the analysis that's come out saying the budget measures will, not improve people's quality of life by the end of this parliament and may actually make some people worse off, that's a tough sell going into a general election. You talk about spending restraint, and actually Rachel Reeves talking about the need for spending restraint and the need for growth. Surely a budget is the forum where you would set out some of those measures. And we had the welfare debacle last summer. Welfare spend has gone up in this budget quite significantly. So where is the restraint coming from? Where is the growth coming from?
450,000 children have been lifted out of poverty.
Regardless of the justification,
so Labour's going to Labour. Let's not forget that we've got at least 3-4 more budgets. And as I said at the beginning of this podcast, I don't think the government will be going into that election, or it's failed on its own terms with the budget as it currently stands. And those OECD remarks are based on the budget and its effects up until 2029.
So you think changes will be made and spending restraint will be a thing going into the next election? Do you think
the budget in 2010, George Osborne's emergency budget, reflected the budget in 2015?
No, but I think the direction of travel. I think the direction of travel was clear, which was a reduction in public spending.
A fiction about the end, about the final years.
It was very clear that there was, over the course of that 5-year parliament, the objective was a reduction in public spending. What you've had in the course of 1 year of this government is a desire to reduce public spending in relation to welfare, and then a rollback and an increase in public expenditure, a desire to get growth, and then a series of measures which may undermine that stated objective. So when you say that the budget may be different in 5 years' time, do you think that is going to be an increase in public expenditure or a decrease in public expenditure, and an increase in taxation or a decrease in taxation?
So I think it will be a decrease in taxation as an overall tax burden. I think there will be a reduction in welfare spending overall, but I think that may be rebalanced across the rest of the public sector. I do think, for instance, you talk about achieving objectives, and yes, George Osborne's budgets did set out an objective of achieving austerity, however you want to define that. It did its job. The government has increased spending on the National Health Service, and that's reaping rewards. We saw that this morning. People are now having, despite the protestation of the BMA, people are now finding it easier and faster to get GP appointments, particularly on Ireland. Right, so it's working in NHS. That was one of the missions. Let's not forget about that. One of the pledges, and lifting the 2-child benefit cap. We were the fastest growing economy, year to date in the G7. Let's not forget that either. So I think it is. We do have potentially 3-4 more budgets. I do think this is a corrective from last year. I don't think it didn't need to have happened had last year been handled properly. I totally accept that. I don't think the welfare vote is indicative of the future direction on welfare. I think I think what we're seeing is, and I discussed last week, I think that there needs to be, for this government to be successful and to be the prospect of Labour being in government after the next general election, then it does need to be more intellectually creative in how it does Labour things. Don't expect a Labour government to do conservative things. Sorry, Green Party. Sorry, Corbyn. But do expect it to be intellectually creative in how it achieves it. So that we now, if this is the steadying the ship, right, we now need to set the direction of travel. And that is a political job for Keir Starmer, less so for Rachel Reeves. And we'll see what happens with that.
Well, that's what I was going to say, is that we talk about, we're talking hypothetically about a change in economic direction or tweaks that are made to the budget by the end of this parliament. Do we think it's Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer that will be in number 10 and number 11, respectively, delivering said budget in a few years' time? I mean, Richard Hughes from the OBR was obviously resigned. There's a huge conversation going on about effectively who said what to when, and, what was hammed up for political reasons in terms of the state of the nation's finances versus what information was actually presented by the OBR and when. Even the cabinet were out firing a few warning shots in the weekend papers about how some of them felt misled by the forecasts or by the presentation of those forecasts, at least at a political level. So is Reeves safe? This is the question that people keep asking me who are, following this story from a distance. Is Rachel Reeves safe, and therefore is Keir Starmer safe, because the two of them and their political futures are presumably completely interlinked?
I think it's the other way around. I think Rachel Reeves is safe as long as Keir Starmer's safe. I think the moment it becomes basically expedient for Keir Starmer, he will dispense with Rachel Reeves, and that will then be the starting gun on the end of Keir Starmer's premiership. If there indeed is an end, I don't think there's a universe in which Rachel Reeves' survival is going to be independent of that, because you're absolutely right. The two agendas are entirely intertwined. We'll have to see. I mean, look, MPs I spoke to and others said the same thing they were saying before the budget, which is the post-budget context, had it gone poorly, would have been a potential scenario in which there might have been a move. It was highly unlikely, but it was a kind of break glass emergency. Yeah, and we've seen the likes of Ed Miliband increasingly increase the tempo. Although Ed Miliband are great, as he said when he was leader of opposition, you could affect policy like with the energy price freeze without being in office. He appears to be affecting number 10 without being number 10. It's almost as if in many respects, Ed Miliband won the general election in 2015. But the fact is, it's all about May and what happens in the polls, Wales, Scotland, London in particular.
So Labour MPs continue to have shaped this previous budget. They will presumably now shape the future of the Prime Minister's survival. Do you get a sense that pre-May there is any desire to make serious political changes to the leadership, or do you think that now they're safe until May? You know, we know who knows what's going to happen in those elections, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a London context later. But does it feel to you that some of the jeopardy that even number 10 were feeling when they threw out that warning shot to Wes Streeting just under a month ago? You know, where do we think that the mood, and you were at the Business London winter reception on Monday night talking to many Labour MPs who were in attendance. What are they saying?
No one, I think, would want to move before May. There's not least because anyone who might be seen as a future leader does not want to own May. So I think the clock is kind of running on a potential challenge before then. There's always an outside chance. They want to see what happens basically in those elections, and people are beginning to think very clearly about, well, if after the May elections and I'm a London MP and my borough's gone heavily green or reform, then we'll start asking questions anew about the leadership. But equally, there's been a very good job by number 10 and just generally party culture, which is destabilising the leadership. It will not help people in May either. Divided parties don't win elections. We know that from the last Conservative administration. So I think it's and those who could be potential challengers are playing a very cute game. Where's Shabana and Miliband? I think that anyone who might seriously be a contender at this stage is not doing anything that smells of a leadership challenge. So I think MPs are actually, I mean, I was in the House of Lords on Monday, as you're saying, they just kind of were ready for a break.
Yeah.
Like it's been a slog. I was chatting to a Treasury Minister who was very much ready for the Christmas, New Year break and just, have some calmer heads prevail. I think they are. I don't think they're febrile. I think they think they're exhausted.
Yeah.
The ongoing challenge, however, for number 10, who has done a good job. One of the questions that I've been asking MPs I've been seeing them is, have you heard your Chequers invitation for the new year, which does include partners, which is good politics, to the kind of the patronage of number 10 is being used. And, yeah, absolutely. And, have a trip out to Chequers. It's a very nice invitation. I saw it with very fancy handwriting on behalf of
Starmer was even in the tea room, as I understand.
Yeah, he's been doing the rounds. He's been in the bar as well. He's bought a pint for a couple of MPs. So I think he's, oh my God, if the MPs are tired, he must be exhausted. So I think everyone wants a break. They're glad that the budget hasn't been a disaster, hasn't been an omni shambles, and Rachel Reeves deserves a lot of credit for that, as do the whole very competent Treasury team. New year, it's a bit of a shuffle around. Rachel Reeves gets a new chief of staff in Ben Nunn. There's some more changes afoot at number 10, potentially. I've told that the Varun Chandra, the very well-respected PM's business advisor, is, the favourite, and it's going to be announced probably in the next couple of weeks for the Washington ambassador job. There are going to be more personnel changes at number 10 that could be destabilising or could be refreshing. So I think everybody is ready for a break. Nobody wants a particular drama before Christmas, but unfortunately, politics has a way of throwing up dramas when you least expect or want them.
Well, let's talk about some other political developments. I was in Parliament last night there with a few MPs, and everyone was sort of checking their phones at one point because this story suddenly dropped on the FT late last night, which was Nigel Farage telling donors he expects Reform UK will do an election deal with the Tories. Now, the whole conversation about any deal with the Conservatives, the so-called unite the right approach, that if you purely look at polls and you say Reform are on about 30%, Conservatives are on about 20%, why not put the two together and suddenly you've got 50%? It's not how the electorate works, but there's obviously been lots of discussion around this, lots of Tory MPs flirting with the idea of going over to Reform.
But a few more this week, of course.
Yeah, and a few more ex-Conservative MPs going over who are, I imagine, concerned about whether or not they might win a parliamentary constituency at the next election. But Nigel Farage has always maintained no deal will be done with the Conservatives. And, Kemi Badenoch has also maintained no deal with Reform will be done, albeit from a weaker electoral position. And so this story has dropped. Nigel Farage apparently has told donors privately he expects a deal to be done. He is said to be pretty burnt by the deal that he did with Boris Johnson in 2019. And so any deal will need to be on his terms. He's subsequently, I should say, come out and denied this immediately, saying no deal will be done. This is a non-story. And
he then strengthened that a few hours later and said it's lies.
Yeah, exactly. So obviously feels that it's damaging, but I can't. It's in the Financial Times. I think we've got to be clear that it will be a well-sourced story, and that's, I think, why many are taking it seriously. But this does reflect, I think, Reform are performing incredibly well. They have been. They've, had a huge amount of momentum. But this does reflect a slight softening in their poll position. It's plateaued largely over the last 6-7 weeks. The Conservatives have stopped hemorrhaging votes as they were heading straight after the summer before party conference. They were definitely hemorrhaging votes. Kemi seems to have been able to stem some of that tide. And although clearly still a very difficult position for the Conservatives, it does feel that this conversation about a deal or a merger or a pact or something is going to become increasingly noisy from figures on the right. I don't think the electorate is as neat as this, and you can just do a deal and take their votes for granted. I don't really see. I can see it annoying a lot of Conservative voters who think that they should be something entirely different from Reform. And actually, Reform is not Conservative in many, many ways. And I think this is the slight contradiction in the way that this is all coming together, and the sorts of MPs that are joining Reform, that were part of the Boris coalition, but actually very few MPs who are from the kind of wider Conservative tradition have come over.
Yeah.
Except for Danny Kruger, I have to say, who remains, effectively one of the first. Well, he was the first sitting Tory to move over and actually do it from a position in Parliament. So, I don't know. I think from a Conservative point of view, this feels like too early to talk about. There's lots of discussions about how you get Reform voters to come back to the Conservatives, but actually, I think the Conservatives are very mindful of the fact that any deal with Reform would almost certainly mean that Nigel Farage would need to be the leader of the party.
Yeah.
That sits very uncomfortably. It's very tricky. Kemi Badenoch's made clear that it's, the oldest political party in the world, and she's not going to start just doing deals with people. It means the Conservative Party ceased to be a national party if they field candidates in some seats and others. So, look, for all sorts of reasons, I don't think this works. But it is interesting that Nigel Farage is privately talking about this, or at least said to be privately talking about this. Yeah. And it probably presents Labour with a very good campaign opportunity.
Well, that's right. Look, it's a bit, he said the quiet bit out loud by mistake, which is clearly there will be high likelihood of some informal, formal pact between the Conservatives and Reform at the next election. It kind of stands to reason at that point. But, on December the 3rd, the Labour opened its political advent calendar, and out pops Nigel Farage talking about a deal with the Conservatives. That's a gift. That's an early Christmas present, because that's what Labour have been saying, is that this is the Tories in disguise, the Tory lifeboat. So, I'm pretty sure the social media team right now will be hammering, targeted online advertising, pointing this out. And as you say, the electorate aren't that, aren't that pliable. The fact is that this would be good for Labour, but actually probably best if this story rumbles on, good for Liberal Democrats, because it's places like the southeast of England, where they won't vote Reform, and actually might, the Lib Dems are savvy, could lead to them picking up some votes as well. As you say, what it does is acknowledge, which I think we've all been saying over the past few weeks post-conference, that it probably is unlikely that they get an outright Reform majority. We are looking at the next Parliament being some level of coalition, collaboration, confidence and supply, whatever the arrangement is, which also begs the question, by the way, in due course, what would Labour and Liberal Democrats do? I am reminded, though, we're going back to the basics on this, of the 2015 campaign, that the Tories ran that was very effective about Ed Miliband being in Nicola Sturgeon's pocket.
Yeah.
And I think,
Vote
just
Labour, get the
copy and
SNP.
paste that. I would do that now with Reform and the Conservatives. This does, it does drive a wedge potentially into the Reform voter coalition. It does say, we've said for a while the infrastructure of Reform is Conservative. Right? A lot of the staffers are ex-CCHQ. It culturally feels Conservative. We've had no significant people come from the Labour Party. Basically, loads of crank councillors, quite frankly. The more significant bleed to the Greens, and even they are people who were mostly deselected for next May in London. So it does demonstrate, actually, it undermines Reform's mission to try and transcend the old left-right divide. They're a populist right-wing party looking to do a deal with potentially a junior partner. Final thought, though, the psychodrama of Farage. You mentioned the 2019 deal with Boris. His nose is out of joint on that. It's clear, Reform at its current polling position, we'll see how it does in May, is not going to do any deal arrangement with the Conservatives where it's the junior partner. So that's going to be an ongoing psychodrama. And that does have to be resolved by the general election if we're in the current polling position, because otherwise that becomes a psychodrama of the election, which would be great. It adds to what I think will be quite chaotic general election. Probably quite nasty, but definitely chaotic. And it might be that many of the current players are not in their jobs when it comes to that. God knows what it means for Farage if he isn't. Reform if Farage isn't in the job. But yeah, as of today, everyone talks about the possibility, the likelihood, in some respects, some Tories like Jacob Rees-Mogg, the desirability of a Reform Tory pact. But the fact is, you would not want to be openly talking about it this early. So ultimately, Nigel Farage would be frustrated that somebody he's brought into his confidence has briefed that out.
Let's talk about the London local elections next year. We will continue to talk about these probably quite a lot in the next few months as the next big electoral test. Obviously, there are elections going on in Wales and Scotland as well. But London, as we've said before, has a unique psychology over the Labour Party. I think many of its members and key activists are based in London. The whole ecosystem is within the capital. And clearly, if there's a bad performance in London next May, that's going to have an impact on the morale of government and the overall functioning of the system. So, look, let's talk briefly about rise of the Greens. How are they performing? Third parties across the patch. How are Reform doing? There are some Conservative Labour marginals too. First kind of discussion on what we think might happen next year and what to look out for, Kevin.
So you obviously talk a lot nationally about the rise of Reform, but on the ground, particularly in London, the rise of the Greens, their poll lead, could have a real governance impact in the capital. In particular, I was talking to some London leaders on Monday, and there's been a lot of chatter that of the big Labour scalp, the London Borough of Hackney, which is an executive mayoralty, there's a lot of resignation that the Greens are kind of on course to potentially take the executive mayoralty and also majority on the council. They're already quite a big presence. There's a number. This tale I'm about to tell, the number of activists keeps increasing when different people tell me, but I'm told that a campaign weekend, the Greens in Hackney, last month, where they had 400 activists out and were able to blanket big parts of the borough, and that's really kind of knocked the wind out of the sails of many in the Labour Party there. So the rise of the Greens is a phenomenon that's not going away in London. Whether or not it'll endure until May, we'll see. But certainly in terms of actually taking a council, lots of people are talking about the ability of them to take the London Borough of Hackney. Of course, London is not a stranger to third-party politics or third-party control. The Aspire Party, we do lots of work in probably the most work of anybody in the London Borough of Tower Hamlets, that's been controlled by Aspire over this term, both the majority on the council and again another executive mayoralty. So when it comes to doing business in the capital, it is important that your strategy is politically resilient. As I say, we've dealt with that over the last 4 years with Tower Hamlets and Aspire, but equally are advising clients on dealing with the Greens and of course with Reform. Probably the one party that we don't currently offer any advice on because they're quite unsure about how they exist themselves is your party. And we don't need to go over the theatre of their founding conference in Liverpool last weekend. But the fact is, on the ground here in London, it's very unclear what force, especially outside Jeremy Corbyn's home ground of Islington, your party will be in these elections. defections from Labour have tended to, on the left, hard left of the Labour Party, have been recently to the Green Party. So your party's not picking up people from the left of Labour the way it would have hoped to. Not only that, I'm also told that lots of people intend to stand as independents next year rather than join the Greens or your party, but will have some sort of endorsement from Jeremy Corbyn, which is curious.
Yeah.
So, he's in the leadership, not a leader, in the leadership or the vanguard of your party, but will have a endorsed platform for independence when it comes to the London elections. I suspect there'll be a non-story. Maybe in Islington, they might be significant, but I think outside Islington, I think your party have probably had their chance, and it'll be the Greens that'll pick up those dissatisfied with Labour, those of hard left politics, and those who are particularly motivated by Gaza and Israel. When it comes to East London and the rise of Islamists, that will be evident again in Tower Hamlets, will be evident in Newham, which potentially will have a similar sort of politics, and also appearing in places like Redbridge. So the politics of the capital are fracturing. It's already had third-party politics. It's about to get a hell of a lot more of it. And actually, what we'd be talking to particularly those in the property sector, is about making sure you're politically resilient.
Absolutely. There's the possibility of all parties having to face some odd results after the elections in May. And, when you're planning for these projects, very often a long pipeline and a long lead-in time. So
absolutely,
lots of planning to undertake. Right, I think we'll probably leave it there, Kevin. We're about out of time. Lots to talk about. And, no doubt over the coming weeks in the run-up to Christmas, there'll be much more scheming and plotting going on across the political scene that we can help you all make sense of. But we like to finish these with 3 key pieces of advice for the week. So I think the first thing from me is, a Labour government is doing Labour things. And we've said it before, we'll say it again, the Labour government is going to be in power until 2029. And as such, manage the Labour Party. We've got a pretty clear view now of what Labour MPs want to see, and we know how things need to be positioned. And so if you want to get stuff done in the short term, work with the Labour MPs that we've got.
Similarly, longer-term public affairs strategies should be reform resilient, but not reform focused. We could have a centre-left or a centre-right or a populist right-wing parliament come 2029, but obviously change takes a long period of time. So obviously we've got a Labour government and a Labour parliament, but you don't need to change what you do, but you do have to change how you present your proposals when it comes to dealing with potential reform MPs, Conservatives, Labour, or indeed the Greens and Liberal Democrats. So my real message for our second recommendation, when it comes to, in the chaos, build in resilience.
And finally, elections. Next May, we'll see a huge set of elections across the capital and beyond. And start planning for that post-May environment. The electoral system is likely to be more, not less fractured. And if you know where to come if you need to make sense of that.